Okay, welcome to lecture 5 on the Immanuel Kant's The Critique of Real Reason. This lecture will be a little bit shorter than the other ones. It is on the judgments, the categories, and a very short bit on the imagination. I'll get to why, much later on I'll get to why this will be a bit shorter. Nearer the end, actually, I'll explain why I don't take as much time on these things as others would. There is recommended reading, once again. I recommend reading in the Hackett edition of The Critique of Real Reason. I recommend reading The Transcendental Logic, the Transcendental Analytic Book 1, Chapter 1 and 2, which is A66 to 83, B92 to 116, and A84 to 95, B116 to 129. But this isn't something I super focus on with The Critique of Real Reason. But let's jump in. So far, the aesthetic and the standpoint of transcendental idealism has shown how objects can be sensed. Okay, that is how they appear, are represented to us via our intuition within space and time. I won't go over this too much because those last 2 or 3 lectures really have emphasised the space and time and the sensible account. The analytic is an account of Kant's arguments regarding idealism in relation to understanding, okay, not sensibility, and the way in which we think of objects and reality, how objects of space and time become objects of our thought, our understanding, how empirical knowledge is made possible. So the analytic, the aesthetic is focusing on sensibility, the analytic is focusing on understanding, and we need for Kant, obviously, both of them together for there to be anything at all. So without sensibility, no objects would be given to us. Without understanding, no object would be thought. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Okay? For there to be an experience, there must be something. And for something to be something, it must be able to be classifiable, like a chair or a person, etc. Okay. So experience and understanding constitute all knowledge, or sensibility and understanding constitute all knowledge. Without both, we would merely have a barrage of sensations with no ability to understand them, associate them, or place them into any coherent whole. So then, really with this, Hume was correct all along, right? What we cannot experience, we simply cannot know. That's the Humean position. That is understand. So what Hume failed to appreciate was that, yes, there is experience, but what he neglected was the conditions for there to be that experience. It's all very well doubting and being skeptical of experience, but this is clarification that there is experience, and as such there must be conditions for that experience, even if that experience is proven to be a representation or a phenomenal, one-sided subjective thing. Okay, so the analytic begins from a different start point than the aesthetic, in that it approaches objects within our thought and understanding without being reliant on the conclusions relating to space and time that come from the aesthetic. Okay, so in the aesthetic we saw that we needed time and space for there to be anything at all. If an object such as a car goes past me, it has to be in space as an object, and time is needed for that object to have that duration of going past me. And certain conclusions come from this. The analytic isn't reliant on these conclusions. It actually begins from its own sort of rules, a certain set of rules relating to faculties of man, and rules which won't lead us back to skepticism, and thus have to be rules which are universal and necessary. If we don't want to fall back into that pit of skepticism and subjectivity, we need to make sure that the rules are universal, necessary, or objective. That is, as the aesthetic is with space and time, these rules would have to be for there to be anything at all. Okay, and within a section of the analytic, which is commonly known as the metaphysical deduction, the actual section is called The Clue to Discovery of All Pure Concepts of the Understanding. Kant loved his long titles. Kant argues that a specific set of 12 concepts are privileged. Okay, these 12 concepts are pure concepts of the understanding. I'll get to them later. concepts of the understanding that have no connection to empirical experience, pure, or concepts of our thought which derive their existence from our faculties alone, as opposed to a posteriori experience. Okay? These concepts or categories are thus a priori and form the basis for all other empirical concepts. So Kant's first question, much like the rest of the critique, is whether or not these concepts can be justified in their legitimization of that which we intuit. Okay, that is to say, why aren't these concepts merely random or spontaneous? These are the questions he asks of the aesthetic. Well, what's to say this is what we get? Why aren't these just random per person? You know, we need to look for these, for Kant, we need to look for these necessary universal conditions of experience. Otherwise, we're getting nowhere. So once again, we're back at this idea of what it means for something to be transcendental. What are the transcendental or enabling conditions for something to happen at all? Okay, so Kant first develops this notion of the transcendental unity of absception. Right? Now, I have a whole lecture on the transcendental unity of absception coming up. It's very important. It comes up in every single lecture on or course of study on the critique of pure reason. It's great. It's brilliant. But I'll just very, very quickly explain what it is here, very roughly. So anyone's watching this and they go, that's not really what it is. I do have a whole lecture on it, but very roughly. Let's say you sense these sense data. A bitter taste, a black viscous liquid, and you smell something sort of round and roasted, and you see a white cylinder with a black top, right? And these are all just random sense data. The transcendental unity of absception pulls these all together, and what do you sense? It's a cup of black coffee, okay? That's what it does. And for Kant, this is the foundation of cognition. It's the fundamental condition. Our self-conscious, via a priori synthesis, intuits this data, which I was just then on about, in accordance with these 12 fundamental categories. So the transcendental unity of absception is this foundational, fundamental thing which brings everything together. But it does so in accordance with these 12 fundamental categories. So, you know, that's why I thought it was needed just to be quickly put in here. Before we get to the lovely analytic of principles. Now, the analytic of principles first argues that the categories that I was on about, these 12 fundamental categories, require some alteration in order for them to work in accordance with objects of temporal intuition. Okay, so the analytic is then split into 4 parts, which come under the sections: the system of the principles of pure understanding, axioms of intuition, anticipations of perception, analogies of experience, and the postulates of empirical thought in general. Kant is very good at getting you tongue-tied without really knowing it, each of which argues for the necessity of a particular set of categories and for the necessity of their employment. This all sounds very confusing and complicated so far. Keep in mind this before we go forward. What Kant is talking about when he talks of judgments and categories is this. We intuit or apprehend sense data. It is then judged and categorized by us. And it's done so via certain sets of categories. We intuit this object, which to us we categorize as a chair, but before that, it's just this object. It has to be fed through, right? So how is this all coming together? Just remember that, and it'll all make a bit more sense. Kant works this all out in a very complex way, as he does with everything. So prior to the analytic, this all sort of builds systematically, so I have to keep dipping in and out to build it up. Prior to the analytic is the transcendental logic. Once again, anyone who's been paying attention, think transcendental conditions, a logic of conditions of that logic. This can be read in A50 to 64, B74 to 88, and A131-36 to B169 to 175. B175. Okay, so this logic, the transcendental logic, is concerned with the rules which govern thought in its relation to objects. Okay, it attempts to show how thought about objects is even possible. Okay, transcendental logic is concerned then with the conditions of the object's existence as a thought. General logic on the other hand, known simply as logic, is concerned with the connections between thoughts. It's almost back to that Humean thing of you have experience and you just deal with the experience, compared to the Kantian step back. Let's deal with, we have this experience, we have this logic, let's deal with the conditions of this logic, okay? So, for Kant, however, and for the reader, this logic can actually be framed easier in a legal framework, right? Whereby, one is taking something to court, which is actually what Kant is doing in the Critique. The rough sort of translation or understanding of the original German for critique is a taking something to court, so that, a jury could verify it, okay? He's taking reason to court, and the critique of pure reason, okay? So, in this sort of court analogy with logic, there would be X, which happens, okay? We, the subject, we experience things in ourselves and understand them, okay? And thus, for X to happen, the conditions of Y and Z, etc., need to be in place, okay? So before a court, someone would stand with this transcendental logic and say, look, this has happened, and let me prove to you, the court, that for this to happen, for X to happen, then we need Y and Z. And this is where this categorization and judgments comes in. Okay, so it's not a logic in the traditional sense, but a transcendental logic, dealing, once again, with conditions. So, where does this really come in? Okay, well, we have to go back a bit. As I've said before, for Kant, there are two supreme principles: sensibility and understanding. Thought related to objects requires intuition, which itself is an act regarding sensibility, the first principle, and as such, transcendental logic, using intuition as its basis of representation, concerns itself with objects as given only in space and time, which is connected primarily with the transcendental aesthetic. Okay, so the logic is in there as to how these two supreme principles are cohering into anything at all. The aesthetic in relation to sensibility, and then the analytic, which is primarily concerned with how the thought of these objects even comes about, and they're not simply just appearing to us. And as such, we find in this section Kant's argument, how are we able to even make these objective judgments with this form of logic regarding this external world of objects, okay? And so for Kant, transcendental logic is of the origin of the modes in which we know objects, insofar as the origin cannot be attributed to the objects. I'll repeat that. A55 and 6, B80. Of the origin of the modes in which we know objects, insofar as the origin cannot be attributed to the objects. That is the transcendental logic. The origin cannot be attributed to the objects. We're performing a logic of the understanding. Okay, so then the reason the analytic is needed is because it's not immediately obvious that following from a priori concepts, space and time, the aesthetic, our reality is not solely empirical. Okay, if we apprehend something not via objects and thus not via our senses. Okay, so if we apprehend something not via objects and not using our senses, then if there is something greater than the reception of the content, then this must be, for Kant, a priori. Okay, this ability of apprehension before objects even come about must be pure and therefore a priori. Okay, it is the work of understanding as opposed to sensibility. So this is where Kant brings in that point that the two supreme principles, we made it clear in the aesthetic that sensibility is absolutely a priori. The space and time are a priori, but how about how we understand it? And this is Kant bringing that in. Okay, so in the act of representing an object, there is a mode of understanding which must come prior to the object coming into relation to the subject. There must be some mode or means of actually even understanding the object before we actually, represent it. There must be that which makes the relationship between subject and object possible in terms of actually an understanding. Okay, there must, for our judgments to be objective, be a mode which is not contained within the sensations themselves. Otherwise, we'd be working with purely subjective. Okay, and this is how experience is made. So what is this really called for Kant? This is called synthetic unity. It's the most minimal form of experience needed for us to discover experience itself. It's synthetic because it involves an act of combination. The synthetic process involves unifying the concept and the appearance into a unified intuition, which we understand. We understand what we've sensed. And then Kant utilises the categories which I've mentioned, to help us understand which concepts supply the a priori conditions of human knowledge. Okay, so this, what we're sensing and what we're synthesizing, is then sort of filtered through these categories and these judgments. So it's only when these first appearances are subsumed under the pure concepts of understanding that we can be said to have an experience of what is present to us, okay? I haven't got many slides on this one because I initially thought about putting the tables of judgments, the tables of categories in, but they can sort of bog you down in a way. And this is the point where I'll say why this is a bit of a shorter lecture and why I don't focus on the judgments and the categories so much. I personally think that if you're these lectures are for people who are like, I still just don't get the critique of pure reason. I'm like, what is it? Why is it so important? And this is really these lectures were about making it clear. This is why it's so important in terms of philosophy. You know, it touches on epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, etc., and it builds this entire thing of critique, and at the same time manages to dismantle empiricism and skepticism. Now, you know, why then wouldn't I include the judgments and the categories so much? Kant scholars are, maybe if they're watching this, they won't be, will be reeling. They'll be thinking you need to include these. If you're coming at the critique of pure reason for the first time and you just want to get it, right? Get the big broad brushstroke and say, yeah, get what the critique of pure reason is doing. I personally think you need that first, then you can go into the nitty-gritty. Focusing on the judgments themselves and the categories, I don't think is particularly helpful. Understanding what they do in the grand scheme and the grand system is. So I don't want us to get bogged down in those sort of, you know, minutiae of these things. Okay. So I'll sort of just give a brief glimpse into them here. So when a subject employs a concept, they are making a judgment. Within a judgment, one representation is brought into relation with another representation in such a way as to create a unification and understanding. Okay, there are 12 forms of judgment for Kant, each creating a different kind of unity. Okay, so the table of judgments is thus. You have quantity, which underneath it is universal, particular, singular. You have quality, affirmative, negative, infinite. You have relation, categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive, modality, problematical, assertoric, apodictic. And you're thinking, okay, like, well, why is that helpful? And this is what I mean. I think unless you're really going into these, I just don't think it's all that helpful to get the broad brushstrokes. Anyway, but I will give you an example. Let's take two common representations. Okay, two things which we understand. Okay, we could take a body, and the representation of divisibility. Okay, something can be divided. Okay, these are two sensible forms in a way because we can understand that second sensible form in the action of divisibility. Okay, we understand them when they're being represented to us via cognition. Okay, so this synthetic judgment would be this body is divisible. We see a body in front of us, a body, not like a human body. you could say that. I don't know, a lump of clay, and it gets divided. This body is divisible. This judgment would then be understood, and you feel you're making a judgment. You represent this thing, this unification. Body, it's been divided. This body is divisible. This judgment, made by our subjective intuition, is then filtered through the categories to see if actually where it stands, right? So what does that mean? It'd be understood in relation to this table of judgments, which I just said, okay? So the judgment, this body, okay, it would be in that first category, you have quantity. Well, what quantity is it? Well, it's this body, so it's singular. Then it's affirmative. Then it's categorical. And then it's assertoric, okay? These judgments provide clues for our pure concept of understanding, but not speak of the content itself. It's like a mode of understanding the content, but it's not the sense data of the content itself, okay? So there are two distinct judgments then. Because you're thinking, well, if we're making judgments, we could get caught up in subjective object, we could get caught up in our subjective judgments. Okay, that's what judgment is. I judge boy bands. I don't like any of them, right? That's a judgment, but it's not objective. There are two distinct judgments. Judgments of perception and judgments of experience. The subjectivity of our perceptions give rise to subjectivity of judgments. Okay, so judgments of perception are subjective judgments. But experience arises under the necessary categories, which I'll get to. The judgments of experience are common across all. Okay, so this is where you separate the judgments out. You have judgments of perception, subjective, judgments of experience, objective. Judgments of perception are subjectively valid. I may enjoy black coffee, another may not. Judgments of experience are different. For with these, we begin with the same framework of intuition. We all have the same framework. We begin from that and go into the judgments of experience. This is then subsumed under the concepts based on the categories of understanding and thus universal. The categories of understanding are quantity, unity, plurality, totality, quality, reality, negation, limitation, relation, which is inherence and subsistence, which is also substance and accident, causality and dependence, cause and effect, and community, reciprocity. And then you have modality as the final category, which is possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, necessity, contingency. And you're thinking, oh my god, I'm so bogged down. Like, once again, it's the same thing with that category of judgments. It gets filtered through and it applies to all these categories. I don't like getting people bogged down in these because I just don't think it helps. So limited to judgments of perception, those subjective ones, one would continuously have to reattend to the world, right? You'd continuously have to be like, do I like that? Do I like that? Is that a subjective thing? There would be no this. There would be no permanence if you were constantly subjective about things. If constantly it was just a perception. Only a world which just seemed constantly new. But when we conceptualize experience and categorize it, the forms are this, right? And this is the judgment of experience. So there has to be this, okay? So the judgments of experience in relation to the categorization of a chair. We all understand it's a chair. Whether or not we approve or like the chair is a judgment of perception and subjective judgment. Okay, so in the words of Dan Robinson, judgment is the power of thought. It makes intuitions just conceivable altogether. Okay, so the content is taken in relation to intuition, pure intuition in this case, since we're concerned just with understanding. So the content is just taken into this pure intuition, which isn't related to the content itself. The pure concepts of our understanding then, which make our relationship to sense data possible, must correspond to the functions of judgments and play a role in organising intuition. Okay, concepts which give rise to a unification of judgment and intuition. Okay, and this is why the table of categories which I mentioned just then is developed with their corresponding concepts which have relation to objects within intuition. Once again, I emphasise just to sort of keep your mind clear and not get too bogged down in these things. We're talking about the analytic and the transcendental logic and judgments and categories in relation to the modes and the concepts and categories which our sensible apprehension of experiential reality is filtered through for us to have in our understanding, a collective understanding of what things are. If we take the hypothetical judgment, if X then Y, it corresponds to the category of causality. If one event then another, we can understand this collectively. It's not a subjective judgment of perception. You know, if I throw a ball, it hits a vase, X then Y, we can understand that as a categorization. Or another example, if X is Y, categorical judgment corresponds to the category of subsistence. X subsists in that which Y is. Okay, so ways to understand the world which are collectively not to do with subjective perception. Without judgments, the subject cannot cognize an object because the concept, the understanding of the object, is not directly related to the judging mind. Judgment then is the mediate cognition of an object. If you think back to that reversal of the arrow, if the mind was going out to the object and the object is exactly as it appears, then that is a realist view. The other way, reverse the arrow, the object straight to the mind is an idealist view, as if the mind is creating the object. And if there's something that's happening in the middle of that arrow, a mediation, then we can understand it's transcendental idealism, because the conditions of our own mind apprehending that object alter it in some way, or potentially alter it in some way, and thus the judgment is that mediate synthetic position which is cognizing the object and is making a judgment, and thus mediating the content to the mind. There's another idea which mediates between subject and object, or between understanding and sensibility, and that is imagination. Very briefly on imagination here. So it's through imagination that concepts and objects become synthesized, according to, once again, another universal rule called by Kant a schema. So this is where we begin to form objective knowledge in a way. You'd think of imagination and objective knowledge doesn't sound about right. Okay, so the imagination connects disconnected sensations, connecting them into something knowable. It doesn't yield knowledge, but simply makes it possible. Okay, from which it is then drawn under the categories of understanding and understood. So you can once again think of this systemization. It's almost like a layering, that certain things happens and another thing happens. We sense the object in time and space as an appearance. It is then intuited and judged via the imagination, then fed through the categories for us to completely understand it altogether. Kant says, in AN 7167, the power of imagination as a faculty of intuition without the presence of the object is either productive. Okay, I'll just emphasize this bit, it's an important bit. Power of the imagination is either productive, that is a faculty of the original presentation of the object, which thus precedes experience, or reproductive, a faculty of the derivative presentation of the object, which brings back to mind an empirical intuition that it had previously. So the imagination is productive in the sense that it has this original presentation and can do something with it, or it is reproductive, that it can bring something back into your mind and work with it. And what's interesting about imagination on Kant's account is that when imagination aims itself at the aesthetic, it is allowed to engage in sort of a free play beyond the understanding available to oneself. Okay, the unconstrained imagination can take raw materials and it can produce outputs which actually transcend the concepts that one possesses. Okay, so when we think of imagination, this is what it can do. It can take understandings and concepts in relation to a certain object and in our understanding turn it into something else. So Kant takes imagination to be constitutive of creativity. What makes a creative process creative for Kant is the involvement of imagination aimed at the aesthetic. Now for Kant himself, I think in relation to imagination, the critique can be quite dry. But when I think of other later philosophers, Ludwig Klages especially, Fichte and Schopenhauer especially, they take the ability with these faculties to alter them into something else to far more interesting levels, especially in relation to imagination. But really with just, that's the end of this lecture, and really with it, what you need to understand is that you have the aesthetic, you have time and space. We sense something in time and space. Sensibility. This sensible sensibility cannot be without understanding, otherwise we do not understand it. So in time and space there is an appearance. It is intuited via our cognitive faculties, which then take it as a representation. We then make a judgment, which is then fed through the categories. So you think of judgments and categories as things which allow us to have a full subjective and objective understanding of the object. There is the appearance of a chair, which is just an object without an appearance of the chair, of the object, what we know as chair, in time and space. We then understand it to be a chair because it is categorized, but then we have that subjective judgment of perception, which allows us to have this subjective, I don't like that chair, etc. But I hope this has been of some help to you. The notes will be for patrons, and anyone who wishes to support, who has enjoyed it. There'll be links in the description below. And I'll see you. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next lecture.